Beautiful. Well, hello and welcome everyone to the first Nano to Novel interview with NaNo Los Angeles. My name is Nicole Williams, pen name Nicole Gomez. I've done NaNoWriMo for 7 years, and for the past 3 years, I've hosted a write-in called Westwards on the west side of Los Angeles. If you're interested in joining, you can reach out to either Julie or Nina on this call, our wonderful municipal liaisons. They'll get you in touch with me and the group. Please feel free to use the chat for questions. We'll be reviewing them throughout, and we'll also have time at the end for questions. I'm very excited to kick off this Nano to Novel series by interviewing the author and my good friend, Brandie June.
Hi.
Hello, welcome, Brandie.
Thank you.
Brandie loves storytelling in all sorts of formats, whether she is marketing animated movies or writing fantasy novels. Most of her early life, she was on stage, or at least as close to the front row as she could get. Initially an actor, she got her BA in theater from UCLA and branched out into costume design and playwriting, eventually getting her MBA. Her first standalone play, a dark comedy about Oscar Wilde, premiered at the Hollywood Fringe Festival to a sold-out run and won the Encore Producers Award. As a writer, she is especially passionate about fantasy and mythology, has published several pieces in anthologies, and is a recent finalist with the Writers of the Future Award. You can find her online on Instagram at the Brandie June, Twitter at Brandie June, and TikTok at Brandie Books. That's BRANDIE. And we will put links in the chat throughout this event. I had the joy of meeting Brandie a few years ago at Y'all West, an annual YA book event in Santa Monica, when we were both in line to meet the fantasy author Tamora Pierce. Since then, she's attended the Westwards meetup, and I've had the honor and privilege of seeing her go through the writing and publishing process, which I'm very excited to talk to her about today. So Brandie's debut novel, Gold Spun, is being published with Kimcat Books, and we're very excited. It's coming out in just 2 days on this Tuesday, June 8th. It's a fresh retelling of the Rumpelstiltskin tale through the Miller daughter's point of view. Except now the Miller's daughter is a con artist, and Rumpelstiltskin is a mysterious fairy with a dark secret. Saturday, June 12th at 10 a.m. Pacific time is the Instagram Live book release party. Kimcat also recently signed for the sequel, so there's more coming. Links for the book, including the audio and digital versions, will also be available in the chat throughout this event. So welcome, Brandie. I'm so excited to have you.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So throughout this event, the Nano to Novel, we're going to be talking about sort of the full lifeline of the novel, from the draft to the revision to hiring people to the publishing process. So we're very excited to dive into that. So first, can you tell us about the initial idea and the drafting process and how sort of NaNoWriMo played a role in that?
Sure, happy to. So the initial idea came as a short story that I wasn't really planning on writing a novel at first, but one year for NaNoWriMo, actually, I gave myself the challenge to write 26 short stories for every letter of the alphabet based on some sort of mythology or fairy tale theme. And I didn't actually get to all 26. But I did get to R, which I did for Rumpelstiltskin, and I wanted to challenge myself to write a short story where he was the hero instead, and see how that would look to kind of flip the script on it. And so that was the short story that really inspired Gold Spun. And from there, I realized that I was really interested in digging into these characters, and kind of my main goal was that I wanted to make all of them more gray, and also morally gray, but also empathetic. So I really wanted to dig into the different characters of, the Rumpelstiltskin character is portrayed as a villain in the original. So I wanted to see how he could be not necessarily the hero in the novel, but more sympathetic, more of a person that a creature that people could relate to and root for, but still also kind of mysterious. I wanted to see how the king character could be as much more sympathetic, because I feel in the original he's just a bastard, telling this poor girl she has to spin straw or death. And I especially wanted to explore how to make the Miller's daughter character really take center stage and really give her a lot of agency. I feel in the original, she just kind of gets batted around where, you know, she's not the one making the claims. It's her dad who has these outlandish claims, and then the king, you know, making her do these outlandish things. So get a name. And Rumpelstiltskin, the fairy tale, is all about the importance of a name. So I really wanted to give her a name, a lot of agency, let her drive the action. And the only way I could see her doing that is if she was the one who initially tries to convince spin gold. So I, you know, that really was the inciting issue for me of creating her as this con artist who, you know, has her reasons for doing it. She's trying, you know, provide for her brothers, you know, hard times, etc. But her choices are not always the best. They're not always the most moral, even though she's a character I feel we can really root for. So I really wanted to kind of give her that dynamic and that driving force. And that's really what inspired me to kind of really dig into this story a lot more and really make it my own.
I love that. So it sounds like you really, you know, with the fairy tale, it's very simple and straightforward, and you have really flat two-dimensional characters, and you really wanted to see all of the players in the story really fleshed out and more three-dimensional.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I really love about retellings, and I've always loved retellings, is that you have sort of this fine line that you're walking between the original tale, which feels in a way, you know, you have elements of it that feel familiar and almost sacred in the way that these stories have been passed down for generations, for hundreds of years. So there's something for the reader that feels like, oh, I know that. But at the same time, it's a very new experience, and there's a lot of things the reader's not expecting. And, you know, so it's a way to really make these kind of archetypal characters come to life.
I love that. And I love what you mentioned, that for NaNoWriMo, you were doing 26 short stories, each starting with a different letter of the alphabet. I know in our writing group, you are one of the NaNoWriMo rebels, meaning that you don't sit down at the beginning of November saying, I'm going to write 50,000 words of a new story. Instead, you take that time to really flesh out an existing piece that you're working on, whether that's editing or whether it's this really creative idea of doing short stories. How does that work for you?
I mean, it works pretty well because I keep doing it. I will say I actually, you know, when I started NaNo, the first time I did NaNo, and the first couple times I did NaNo even, I did start with the traditional, I'm going to write 50,000 words of a new story in November. And that's really how I got involved in NaNo, and is how I initially really got the confidence to be like, okay, I can put aside all of my personal critique and just write. So I have some sort of draft. And so that was, you know, a really great way for me to get into NaNo and get involved in NaNo. The last few years, though, I felt that for me, I've had different priorities that have had to, you know, had to kind of trump doing the traditional NaNo in the way that a lot of times I'll, you know, now be like, oh, I have a story that I've already written and I really want to get to editing so I can send it to my agent, or, oh, my publisher has these deadlines, so I can't take a month off to do a new novel, but I want to participate in the community, so I will do so while rebelliously editing my book or whatever I need to do.
That's perfect. Just use it for what you need. Exactly. And so for your editing process, I know that for Gold Spun, you hired a freelance editor for the revision process. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to search for one and what that process was like once you had hired them?
Sure. When I was looking for an editor, I had, you know, Gold Spun's my debut novel, so I hadn't published a novel before, and I really wanted to give it the best, most polished shot at getting picked up by a publisher. So I decided to go with an editor. I had gone with an editor with a prior book, but that was really a lot more in the way of like line editing, copy editing. So much smaller things, and grammar, of course. So here I wanted to take a bigger look at it. So I decided to go with someone who would first do a developmental edit, which if anyone doesn't know, means kind of you worry about the grammar and all of that stuff later when you're, done with all the content, and they take a look developmentally of like, how does the story as a whole flow? Are there like big plot areas that need to be addressed? Is some area lagging, or, do we really need to pump up the action here? So that was what I was looking for. And as far as how I found an editor, I used to attend a lot of the GLAWS events, which is the Greater Los Angeles Writers Society. And going to their events and their conferences, I got to hear a variety of editors speak and learn about their process. And from there were a couple editors that I was interested in, so I reached out to them. One, for their rates. Also, something that a lot of editors will do is, they'll do a kind of a preview for you. So maybe 5-10 pages that they'll edit for free, so you can see what their process is like, or maybe they'll do 50 pages at a discounted rate, just something so you can see if you guys are a good fit. Something else that this editor has done is I've actually been done testimonials for her when she had other potential clients, because I think it's really important that you find an editor that's going to be a good fit for both you and your book. So that is really how I started the process with her.
And you mentioned that you were part of some organizations like GLAWS and, correct me if I'm wrong, Greater Los Angeles Writing Society. Is that correct?
It's the same organization, yes.
Yes. And so I sort of know you as the writer who also does the hustle, who goes to all the events, who volunteers, who networks, and makes a lot of those connections. Can you talk a little bit about both how you found that's helped you, how you've had to balance that with your work, and if you have some recommendations for some organizations or things that folks here in Los Angeles can get involved with?
Sure. And also, to Eva's point, the editor is Elaine Ash. Don't mind sharing her name at all. She's fantastic. I really liked working with her. So I'd say, especially starting out, it was a great time for me to kind of dip my toe wherever I could. And I also was financially pretty strapped. My husband has been in school and out of work, so I've been the only one working. So, looking at a bunch of conferences, it was a bit overwhelming, the idea of paying to attend a lot of them. But I also know that one of the best things to do as a writer, in addition to writing, is to build up your network. So what I started doing was a lot of volunteering. So even though you can't necessarily attend the entire event in the way that you want, because part of the time needs to be spent volunteering, a lot of places will let you volunteer in exchange for free admission. And you also generally get to know the people in charge. So I started as a volunteer at GLAWS, just wherever they needed help, going to a bunch of different events. So Nicole mentioned that we met at Y'all West. I had volunteered there for a couple of years as well. And just any place that I could volunteer, I would. And from that, I got a sense of what places I wanted to keep volunteering at, keep attending. There's been several writing conferences that I've attended. Initially, mostly as a volunteer or an attendee, and more recently as a speaker or a teacher giving seminars or a panelist. And something that has been more of a challenge lately has been finding that balance, because initially I had no deadlines and could do the writing at really whatever pace I wanted, which was great. If I was going to a conference for a weekend, I probably wasn't going to get any writing done because I was going to be very busy. So as I have progressed in my writing career, I have had to make more choices as to what needs to be a priority, which is not necessarily that I don't like a group, but I don't necessarily have time to volunteer at a bunch of events or attend a bunch of events. I used to through GLAS, I used to be a part of several critique groups, and they were great. And I highly recommend writers join critique groups. But after a certain amount of time for me, after several years, once I was on contract and deadline for my book, I realized I literally did not have time to go to several groups to give the feedback that the other people in the group deserved, and to write my novel, and to work on editing, and to et cetera, et cetera. I do also work full-time. I'm a marketing director for kids films and anime, and that is a really busy full-time job. And so the writing is, it's nights, it's weekends, it's lunch breaks. So I have had to prioritize and decide where my time is most valuably used. I've become more particular when I choose the conferences I go to. So there are several large sci-fi fantasy conferences that I really like. The Nebula conference is actually this weekend, and it's a great conference that I really like, but I also realized I don't have time to attend a conference the weekend before my book comes out. So it's kind of figuring out what groups, what events are going to benefit me and my book. And, but when I have the time, and especially if anyone's starting out, I highly recommend, put yourself out there. You never know who you're going to meet and how that person can be, a friend and a support and a contact to you in the writing world.
Absolutely. And that's how you met your agent. Is that correct?
Yes. I met Steve Hudson's my agent. I actually met him at a GLAS conference. The GLAS conferences would do one-on-one pitches where you could sign up and you'd have 5 minutes one-on-one with an agent, which I think is great because it really distinguishes you from, a cold query pile of, hundreds of emails, which is sometimes the only way to reach agents. But whenever you can meet someone in person, I highly recommend it. So I actually pitched him on another novel that he said, okay, send it to me. I sent it to him, and then he very nicely rejected it. But we kept in touch at, future conferences. So one time he pulled me aside and he's like, I have some notes for you. If you want to make these revisions, I'll take another look. So I did, and he signed for that book. Unfortunately, that book has not sold and was on solicitation first. So it was a little disheartening of like, you think, oh, I have my agent, I'm going to publish, it's great. And that didn't quite work. But while that was being solicited to publishers, I was working on the edits for Gold Spun, so that when we kind of decide, okay, we need to shelve this project for a while, it's just not getting any traction, I had another shiny book to be like, well, how about this one then?
That's great. So what you mentioned that you had the one book shopping out, and then you ended up doing Gold Spun. Was there any overlap, and what was that shopping around experience like? Your agent was doing most of it for you, which is, I'm sure, helpful, but obviously you were still heavily involved.
Yeah, to me it was pretty stressful. I'll be honest, that I like having things in my control because I know I can work really hard on them. And once you sign with an agent, or start submitting to agents or submitting to publishers, or having your agent submit to publishers, it's really out of your hands at that point. You can write the best book possible, you can do a really good query letter and make sure you follow their guidelines, but beyond that, it's really up to them whether or not they want to pick it up or not. So once my agent started submitting my first novel, I kind of found that the only thing that could stop me from being overly anxious all the time about it was to work on a new book. So while he was working on that, well, actually, even while I was like pitching my first book to agents and just kind of stressing about whether or not they were going to respond, even then I started, drafting Gold Spun, because I couldn't make an agent decide to sign with me, but I could write my next book with the idea that, okay, well, I would love book one to sell, but if it doesn't, I will have this next book to send out into the world. So it was a lot. It was a lot of overlap, and it's almost a bit challenging when people ask how long Gold Spun took, because it was sort of in pieces. Like there was like, okay, there was the initial drafting, but then I got an agent, so I was then going back and doing edits with him on the first book, and then the first book was being out solicited, so then I went and did edits on Gold Spun, and then once Gold Spun finally, sold to a publisher, then went back and did edits with the publisher on Gold Spun. So it was definitely lots of overlapping, but for me at least, always having a writing project to work on was good, because it kept me busy and grounded in the way that, this is something I can do and I can create.
So you can always come back to the writing portion of it, which is, of course, why you're doing this in the first place.
Yes. I can keep telling stories. I can't tell, I can't force people to take the stories, but I can keep telling them.
Of course. And as far as timeline, you mentioned that, of course, there's a lot of bits and pieces, and it's not always linear, and you're not always 100% focused on just Gold Spun. But you mentioned that the first initial short story that inspired Gold Spun, that happened in 2016. Is that correct? So
yes.
All told, bits and pieces, it's been about a 5-year journey.
It has for Gold Spun. I'd say my journey to become a published author has lasted, has been longer than that, because I was, first working and pitching my first book. So the whole process that way has been a lot longer, but yeah, I'd say probably about 5 years for Gold Spun.
Great. And can you talk a little bit about, it sounds like you were doing a lot of the networking with the goal of finding an agent and going into traditional publishing. Can you speak a little bit about what appealed to you beforehand about traditional publishing rather than independent, and if you ever considered independent?
Sure. And I will just clarify that I do kind of see a difference between necessarily independent versus self-publishing, because sometimes we'll look at smaller presses as independent.
You're correct.
So yes. There's you have your big presses, and then you have more of your smaller independent presses, and then you have self-publishing, and there's also hybrid, which is another thing I won't dig too much into. But for me, I did really want to traditionally publish. It was my goal. And I wouldn't say that that is the only right way to publish a book. I have several friends who are very successful self-published authors. For me, I really wanted the extra support that a publisher can provide. I have worked extremely hard on this book, and especially even now, I'm with a smaller independent publisher. So even though they're doing a certain amount of marketing and production, I'm also been taking on a lot of marketing on my own end. But I wanted the support of a publishing house to help with greater awareness, to help with production. They have a designer who designed the cover. They are the ones who hired and took care of getting the audiobook made. So for me, it was sort of that, having that extra support. It's sort of, I think someone once mentioned it, kind of the analogy of being a self-publisher is sort of like running your own restaurant, whereas traditional publishing is more like being a chef, where when you do self-publishing, you have control over everything, which is both good and bad, depending on what you want. Many publishers have a lot more say in what the cover is going to look like, or how it's going to be marketed, or when it releases. Where if you're self-publishing, you get to decide all of that, but you also have to decide all of that. And initially my goal was, I did want to go with one of the big, used to be Big Five. I feel like there's been so many mergers. I'm not entirely sure if it's the Big Four. Anyway, I did want to go with one of the bigger houses, so we did submit it there. None of them picked up, so we did end up going with Camcat Books, which is a newer publishing house, but they're also very, enthusiastic and very proactive, and I've been very happy with my experience with them. They let me have a lot of say in the cover art design, and they've been really great to work with. So that is how I ended up with CamCat.
Perfect. And it sounds like your expectations of going into traditional publishing with certain goals in mind of getting that support, it sounds like you mostly were able to find that support with CamCat. Is that correct? Were there any big unpleasant surprises or pleasant surprises?
There wasn't any big unpleasant surprises. I'd say maybe lots of little surprises because this was a new process for me. I feel I was a little more prepared maybe than most people because I work in distributing and marketing movies and TV. So I'm somewhat familiar with kind of the production life cycle of how home media works, but still there's many things that were different. I really enjoyed working with my editor there. So in addition to the freelance editor, once I joined with CamCat, they assigned me one of their editors, and we did have additional changes to make and additional notes. And so it was a lot of work, but ultimately I was really happy and felt like the story was even stronger. I really appreciate all of the help they provided with, they did the final copy editing. They did, they worked very closely with me to do the cover art, which I think is gorgeous. I'm so happy with it. I knew that the marketing was an area that I wanted to be very proactive in. They have a marketing person, which is great, but it is one person for their whole team. And as a smaller publisher, they don't necessarily have the reach or the marketing dollars that one of the bigger houses would have. So that is an area that I knew going in, I would probably want to help push. And they were very amenable to me working to market my book. I do also have my master's in marketing, and it's what I do for a living. So I felt rather equipped to do it. And I also decided early on, I decided to hire a PR company to help as well, because I knew there were certain things I could do, and there were certain venues I could reach out to and certain content I could make, but there was a lot of things I, as an author, couldn't do on my own. I can reach out to a lot of various press sites I knew I couldn't reach out to, but a PR company could. So I did that as well.
So you had sort of the double pronged, like you were working on it, or triple pronged, like CamCat was doing a little bit, you were working on it, and you had a publishing company participating.
A PR company. Public relations. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So that's been great, to have, I think, all of us working together. We've been on, all of us have been on emails. I know I've heard stories of some publishers being a little more precious working with outside PR, but CamCat was very open to it. So it's been really great because the marketing person at CamCat got Gold Spun reviewed by, say, would do like the trade reviews, and got the Bookish box deal. And I've been reaching out to TikTok book reviewers, and I've been reaching out to podcasts, and the PR company has gotten more, blog and interviews on more prestigious sites that I wouldn't have been able to reach out to on my own. So it's been a nice 360, I think.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like a lot of full coverage. It sounds like you're still doing a lot of the hustle once you've signed that deal.
Yeah, and even the book comes out on Tuesday, and I have a ton of things just this entire month at least. I'm hoping it lightens up after this month, because I owe them an outline for the next book, but which I have really not worked much on. So
yeah, it definitely sounds like a lot of work and also very rewarding. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about when you did sign on with CamCat Books, and what the contract process was like, the negotiations, how your agent played a part in that? I know that's probably for first time publishing authors is probably a big sticking point and a lot of unknowns going on in there.
Yeah. I knew one of the people at CAMCAT I've known actually for a few years through conferences. So was familiar, and kind of friends with her when CAMCAT formed. And initially they weren't taking, I think, YA fantasy. So once they were, she spoke with me and Steve, and we submitted, Steve did the process to submit Gold Spun. They got in touch with him, and then he got in touch with me to let me know that they liked Gold Spun. They wanted to sign me on, which was awesome. And I got an advance that was nice. It wasn't a huge advance, but it was something, which was good. And then they sent the contract over. I reviewed it. Steve reviewed it. I spent like several hours looking over like 7 pages. It was, there were a few minor things, but overall it was a pretty standard contract. So I had a call with Steve about it. I discussed any of my concerns. I asked him a lot of like, is this normal? Is this standard? Should we change this? And then once we had our notes and feedback, he went back to the publisher and basically worked out the details there. So the nice thing, I would strongly recommend everyone look at your contract before signing, definitely 100%. But the nice thing too about having a reputable agent is that they should also be able to look at the contract, see if it's, if there's any red flags there. They should then be able to go back to the publisher to, negotiate on your behalf. CAMCAT at this point is doing pretty standard contracts. So honestly, the negotiation was somewhat minimal, especially because a lot of it was pretty standard and I really wanted to get my first book out into the world. But that was the contract signing process. And then I signed the contract and we dove into work.
Awesome. And so you signed for the first book, Gold Spun, with CAMCAT, and that was very exciting. And then later on, they signed for the sequel, which is amazing and exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about like what went on sort of in between there? Like what led up to them signing for the sequel?
Sure. So admittedly, even when the first book was being pitched, I had kind of hoped that it would get picked up as a duology or a trilogy. And CAMCAT, especially being a newer publisher, was doing more, let's sign the first book, see how it goes. And then, they had right of first refusal, which meant for my next book in this series, they had the right to take a look at it first and make an offer. I wasn't required to accept their offer, but I also knew that if I had a good working experience with them, it would be ideal to do the entire series with the same publisher. So at first it was mostly just, let's focus on this book. We have to do a lot of edits, a lot of production. We need to make a really great book first. And so that was really the main focus. And then once we were done with all the editing and most of the production, and I was sort of less involved because it, got into like the technical layouts and things that I didn't need to be as involved with. That was when we started to discuss the next book, because publishing also has pretty long lead times. As I mentioned, Gold Spun was picked up in July and now it's coming out now. So this was 11 months. So we wanted to, and we all had a good working relationship. So the idea was let's discuss the sequel early to at least, start thinking about when it can get put on the schedule, if they're going to pick it up. So I submitted, generally with a lot of publishers, you will submit the entire manuscript. It's a little different after you've initially signed with them. I know some people are able to sell books on basically on just the pitch. With the sequel to Gold Spun, I had actually drafted a lot of it because again, when Gold Spun was out, I needed something to work on. So I drafted a fair amount and I had a pretty detailed outline. So I submitted that to them and they were interested in it. So again, it sort of then got sent over to my agent and we discussed again and was like, yep, this seems good. So once we signed, then I had a long call with my editor about the direction of the story. There were some pretty big issues that need to be resolved, which makes sense for a first draft. I totally agree with. And we were kind of discussing as well of like, okay, does this make sense to be a duology or a trilogy, which is part of what I'm working out now as far as the outlining goes, because that'll really affect how the final book gets written. Because right now I have a draft, but it is a very, very rough draft that needs many, many changes. And what I really like is that she and I are both on the same page that no matter if it's 2 or 3 books, ultimately I want this series to have a very, very satisfying feeling for readers. I think readers will really enjoy Gold Spun, but I definitely feel like it leaves them wanting more from the story. Hopefully, Nicole, you've read it. Hopefully you both enjoyed it and wanted more.
Yes, both of those things.
I think there's a lot more to Noor, the main character's story, that I'm looking to tell. And I do feel like when I've told this series, I want it to be that just really satisfying, like when you get to the closure of a series and you're like, oh, okay, that was good. I'm happy. I'm content. So that's sort of what I'm working on now as far as figuring out what changes to do to the outline.
Definitely. And yes, I can attest that Gold Spun is great and it's such a great read. And you get to the end and you're like, I need more. So very happy that there's a sequel coming and maybe even more.
Yeah, I think we're still kind of figuring out what's the best shape of this series, but whatever shape it is will be I want it to be a very satisfying shape.
Definitely. Can you talk about some of both the fun parts of publishing or the things that have brought you some of the most joy? I know you've purchased swag. I know you've made some personal decisions about your pets related to your book.
Yeah, hold on.
The puppy.
So right after I signed for Gold Spun, I adopted this adorable little puppy. And my husband suggested we name her Noor in celebration that I just sold Gold Spun. So this is puppy Noor, and I love her to pieces. And like my main character, she is also likes to steal things, mostly like sandwiches. So this was kind of the first celebration thing because we got her in July, right after the book sold, and I have loved her to pieces, and she is a little terror who I adore. So that was a lot of fun. Just knowing I had a book coming out has been really exciting. Getting great hearing from people has been really exciting because for so many years this story has been in my head or maybe shared with just a couple of people, and getting early reviews, which I feel like people say don't read, but I can't stop myself from it. For the most part, they've been very positive, and hearing people tell me that, oh, I read it in one day, I couldn't put it down, or I love the characters, has just really warmed my heart. And I found a big book community, especially a YA book community on TikTok. And the people there are just so delightfully nice. So I have a small account on TikTok, but I reached out to a lot of the bigger accounts of book reviewers to, if they reviewed similar books, to reach out and be like, hey, would you like an arc of Gold Spun in exchange for a review? And for the most part, they've been so delightfully nice. So that's been really great. I did create a bunch of Gold Spun swag. So if anyone goes on my site, brandiejune.com, anyone who pre-orders the book or even checks it out or requests it from the library gets some various swag. I made a bookmark and a map was very excited to, see the final map illustration. So I made it into a postcard. I made some Gold Spun bracelets because gold bracelet ties into the plot very well. And my best friend's a costume designer, so she actually hand painted the 3 main characters. So I used the Noor character on a door hanger. So that's all been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun to talk with people. So coming on different podcasts and kind of geek out about fairy tales and writing is some of my favorite things to geek out about. As you mentioned, on Saturday, I'm doing a virtual event on Instagram Live as a way to have like a big party with everyone, because, with both, just hopefully we're seeing the end of COVID, but, we're still limiting things socially and also just geographically. It's limiting to have in-person things. So I'm going to do a virtual live event party and just be able to, chat with everyone and do some giveaways is exciting to just sort of get to the point of like, okay, I've done it. It's here. Let's celebrate.
That's so exciting. And I'm so glad to hear that while the publishing process has been a lot of work, there are still some very rewarding and exciting parts of it, in addition to having a book published.
Yeah, I've been really stressed lately. Just the anxiety of like, my body doesn't seem to recognize how much of it's excitement and how much of it is nerves and anxiety, because I'm very excited, but I'm also very nervous. So I've been a little like, so I think knowing like it's coming out, it's already written, will be good.
Yes, we're very excited for Tuesday and for Saturday for the event.
Yeah.
So just to sort of wrap up my questions before we see if there are any questions from the chat, what are some of your biggest takeaways from the publishing process? Things that you might either do differently the next time, or you're glad that you know now, or advice you might give?
I'd say the first one is realizing it is a marathon, not a sprint. I mean, as I mentioned, this process for Gold Spun has been 5 years. You can tack on quite a few years beyond that if you want to look at the first time I wrote a novel or even the first time I wrote a novel I felt ready to submit to agents. So knowing, at least with the traditional publishing path, it can be a very, very long process, and to just not give up and keep going, because, for me, I had the mindset of, if my first book doesn't sell, maybe my second will, or my third will. And I'm really glad I did, because if I had given up after my first book didn't sell, that would have been it, and I would never had Gold Spun. So doing that, and also having a good writing tribe has been so important to me. The Westwards Get Together group has been just core to my sanity. Thank you guys, because writing can be it's a very solitary thing generally. Most of the writing I do is by myself in my little home office with my headphones on. So it can get kind of lonely, and it's really important to have those people that are going to support you, and in turn you support them. And I've felt with, the people in my life who are part of my writing tribe are people that are going to, they're going to build me up and, encourage me when I get rejections, which, some rejections I don't care, but sometimes I get a lot. It's like, oh, am I a total failure? And having the friends who are like, no, you're not. That's a stupid thing to say. So supporting during rejections and also celebrating during victories. I'm thrilled when I see, the other friends in my group getting things published or getting stuff out there, or even just, writing things, and vice versa. They've always been supportive and celebratory when I have wins. So I'd say building your writing tribe, both because, some members in your tribe are good contacts to have in the industry and to help you, learn and advance your career, but also having, having people who are legitimately friends and, can go on this process with you as you go on it with them.
Oh, Brandie. I'm so happy you're part of our writing tribe.
Me too.
But yeah, so I see a question from Dana, and also if you want to use the reactions to raise your hand, we can call on you and you can unmute yourself and you can ask a question outside of chat as well. But to start off, Dana has a great question. How does the experience of writing the sequel differ from writing book one?
Well, I feel like I can more thoroughly answer that question once the sequel's done. Because when I will say when I was writing the draft, the really early draft of the sequel, it was very similar to the first book because at the time I was writing it, I didn't have a deal for Gold Spun. So I had no timeline to write it. I just needed to be writing. It was kind of fun to really dive even deeper into the characters and kind of expand on the world. And, there are things in the sequel I got to really dig into that I only hint at in the first book. I will say you get to see a lot more of the fairy world in the second book. But when I was doing the initial draft, it did feel very similar to any writing I had done previously. At this point now, I feel a bit more pressure because I now have the contract for the second book. I have some deadlines for it. I owe them a revised outline at the end of this month. I have people who are reading a lot more people who are reading Gold Spun, and so in some ways the stakes feel kind of raised of the people who are like, okay, I really like that. What's show me what's next, or I need more, which is exciting and flattering, and I love it. But it's also like, oh goodness, I don't want to let anyone down. And so I will say right now, I feel a bit more pressure with it. But I also feel more pressure, but I also feel very excited to have people looking forward to it, to have a publisher who, now believes in me, believes in my books, and the confidence in myself of knowing, okay, well, I've published a book, I've done this once, I'll probably be able to do it again. It's funny, every time I start a new draft of a new book, I'm like, oh shoot, I've completely forgotten how to write. I have no skills. I lost it all, because I go from, editing this manuscript that's, to polishing it to as perfect as I can be. So it's really, really pretty. And then jumping into a super rough draft that's going to be really messy and awkward, and parts are just going to be awful. But you have to get that draft done so it can be edited, so it can be revised, so it can be polished. So that transition always kind of jars me, but I just know that if I push through, I will eventually get a draft, and then I will polish it and get a prettier draft.
Yeah, it's always fun to go back to those first drafts after a little ways away and be like, oh man, what did I write?
Right. But on the other hand, I've felt like oh man, I can't believe I wrote this. And then there are other times where I'm like surprising myself, being like, oh, hey, that's actually pretty good. I like that.
Yes. Always good to have both.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Eva. Did you use your developmental editor on your first draft, or did you do some revisions on your own? Did you wait until the second draft to get the developmental editor involved?
I waited until I was a few drafts in. I basically went in with the mindset of, I'm going to make this book as pretty much as perfect as I can make it, and then give it to the editor to make it even better. I figured that I didn't really need her expertise, and I didn't really want to pay for extra time to work on things that maybe I could do on my own first. So I went through a few rounds on my own making changes. And then once I had it at a place where I'm like, okay, I can't think of how to improve this right now, that is when I reached out to her. I think that was also when I reached out to some beta readers, Nicole amongst them. Okay, here's a book I wrote. I think it's as good as I can think right now. And then they come back with feedback, and my editor came back with feedback that was great, because it wasn't she wasn't telling me how to make changes, but by pointing out some of the issues and doing some brainstorming, it helped me come up with ways of making elements of the story stronger, or, picking up the pace in certain places. So yeah, so I kind of waited until I was like, okay, this is as good as I can do on my own. Let's bring in outside help.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And I like this question from Valerie. How did you decide which elements of the fairy tale were mandatory and which ones were more flexible?
Oh, that is great. That is a great question. I think that's a important question for any retelling. For me, I really wanted to look at what was the core of the story to me, which could be different to other people doing retellings. But for me, the core was the three main characters, the king, prince character, the miller's daughter, and Rumpelstiltskin. Having those three characters and really fleshing them out and making sure that their roles were pretty similar to the original tale, but providing all of the backstory for them, that they had reasons to do the things they did. I, wanted the king to lock the miller's daughter up in the tower, and because he was convinced she could spin gold, but I wanted to give a much stronger reason as to why he thought that, how he could do that in a way that the reader could be like, yeah, I understand why he did that, as opposed to just thinking, oh, he's a jerk. So kind of having that initial, so I really focused on those three characters and at least the initial part of the story, because I feel like Rumpelstiltskin ends with a room of gold and she gets his name and, everyone lives happily ever after. And a lot of Gold Spun takes place kind of in what might be considered a happily ever after in the original. Not entirely, but many elements of okay, she has a room of gold. Now what? What does that mean for her? What does that mean for the world? A lot of it was, as I dug into her character, wanted to have her do that arc of really coming to a decision about what kind of person she wanted to be now that she had some more choices.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about Gold Spun is that you take this very generic setting, right, of this medieval fantasy England, right, of that sort of traditional fantasy setting, and you take it and you create this entire world and you add on to it and you flesh it out so that there's politics and history to the world, more so than just the characters, who also, of course, get their own history. So I think it's, for Gold Spun in particular, it was less a matter of stripping away elements and more a matter of adding on.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent way of saying it. I love that. I definitely have, my own map, and I kind of love creating fantasy worlds, because I can, take influences of, I had a lot of influences of like late medieval, early Renaissance Europe, but this is also fantasy world. So I, also the flexibility to change things, like create a land where fairies lived, or, create dialogue, create vernacular. One of the things I love, especially as I write YA, is if this is a fantasy world, I can make up swear words. So I don't have to worry about like, how, they're really upset and they would totally be swearing in real life. But in YA, I'm not necessarily wanting to, drop the F-bomb, which wouldn't make sense for medieval anyway. But when I'm creating my own world, I can be like, I can kind of get away with it when I'm like, oh, I made up this word. Yeah, it means terrible. It's really foul. What does it mean? It's made up.
Exactly. A lot of different contexts in a different world.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to sort of paraphrase and tweak this question a little bit. Eva asked about comparisons to the TV show Once Upon a Time, because Rumpelstiltskin plays a big part in that TV show. I'm going to sort of expand that and ask, how did other retellings play a aspect in your mind as you were writing this story? Because I know there's there's Once Upon a Time, and there's a bunch of others, and Gold Spun manages to come out as entirely unique from those, which is an impressive feat in today's day and age.
I will say, when I was thinking of doing Gold Spun, one of the things that appealed to me was the sort of dearth of Rumpelstiltskin retellings, because I love retellings, and there have been Rumpelstiltskin retellings, such as Once Upon a Time, but there weren't a lot of Rumpelstiltskin retellings, as opposed to if you look at Beauty and the Beast retellings or Cinderella retellings. And I've read some really great ones that I've loved, but I liked that this was something a little off the beaten path. And like one of my favorite books, Spinning Silver, which is another Rumpelstiltskin retelling in a very different setting. Actually, I had already written Gold Spun when Spinning Silver was announced. So I was very excited to read it, but it wasn't something that I had used as influence for creating this. I'd say similar to Once Upon a Time, I liked, I'd say similar to that, the Rumpelstiltskin character in that show is also this morally gray character who, it feels like sometimes he's the hero, sometimes he's the villain. And I absolutely love morally gray characters. I love the, you're not perfect, but I still want to root for you. Now I feel guilty for rooting for you. I just think they make such interesting, juicy characters. And I watched the first few seasons of Once Upon a Time, but I will say, actually, I kind of stopped watching at some point when it felt to me too much of just good versus evil, where it became almost too black and white for me. Whereas I really like the morally gray of, like, doing bad things with good motivations. And you're like, oh, who do I root for? Doing bad things with good motivations. So I'd say that that's kind of where I was at with Rumpelstiltskin. Some of the other retellings that I've just loved were like the Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Marr I'd read beforehand, and just love the idea of taking these characters that feel kind of familiar, but like making them into new people.
Absolutely. And I think we have time for just this one last question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I know Julie mentioned in the chat that we got a question previously from a post on the event. Was there anything your publisher changed in the story before publication? And you did mention that throughout the publishing process, you also worked with a second editor and made changes with them. So was there anything, that one of the adages is kill your darlings, like, you cut scenes that you really love or you swear are going to be in the end. So was there any, can you tell us just a little bit about that portion of
Certainly.
the process?
Yeah, it was funny. I feel like killed a lot more of my darlings with the freelance editor, whereas my editor with CamCat was actually like, hey, why don't we add stuff here? Or, why don't we elaborate here? We've already signed, let's give them some more. So I actually ended up writing quite a few more scenes, adding a few chapters. I did make quite a few changes after signing with CamCat, working with the editor. It was very much a partnership process where my editor had notes and concerns, and we discussed and I brainstormed. What I really liked is that she gave me the opportunity really to make the changes. She wasn't, saying you have to change this to this, but it was more like, hey, I don't see enough conflict between these two characters. Maybe if you added a scene like that. So there were definitely changes. For example, the prologue and the epilogue weren't in the original story. So those I added on later on. There's a few other scenes that I don't want to give away, but that came through, discussions and revisions with my editor. So there was definitely changes. There wasn't anything where they were like, oh, we cut this out, surprise. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brandie. Thank you so much for coming and for speaking with us about the publishing process. I know a lot of people in the NaNoWriMo community are interested in learning more about this process, so it's so great to get a firsthand experience from you. We're very excited about Gold Spun coming out again this Tuesday, June 8th, live Instagram event, Saturday the 12th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Again, you can find Brandie all over the internet. Her website is brandiejune.com, Instagram, the Brandie June, Twitter, Brandie June, TikTok, Brandie Books. And I will go ahead and pop the link to the Amazon link for Gold Spun right there in the chat. Of course, you can also find it at Barnes & Noble. You can find it directly through CamCat, and you can find it at bookshop.org, which supports local bookstores.
And I will be doing a signing at Dark Delicacies too on the 26th.
Yes, that's correct.
It's
and that's
on my
at
site.
3 p.m.?
3 p.m. So
Okay.
that's also on my site under events.
Yes, up in Burbank. So we hope to see you there. Thank you again, everyone, so much for joining us. And thank you again to Brandie. We're so excited for Gold Spun.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.